Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
News and stories from the sex industry.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Welcome back to another episode of the Peep Show podcast. Today we will be talking to Phoenix Calida, co-host of the Black Podcast and board member of SWOP-USA. We discuss the Black Lives Matter protests, how over-policing disproportionately impacts Black sex workers, and what allies can do to support racial justice.
This episode of the Peep Show podcast is sponsored by Quick and Dirty Media.
Are you an independent content creator, webcam model, or clip maker? Quick and Dirty Media can help you with your video editing and production needs at a reasonable price, allowing you to devote more time to creating your content. As a special offer for Peep Show podcast listeners, the first 5 content creators who submit a video for editing will receive their first order free. Make sure to use the promo code PeepShowPod. Find Quick and Dirty Media on Twitter at QuickDirtyMedia or send an email to info@quickanddirtymedia.com. Quick and Dirty Media is proud to be an adult-friendly business.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Welcome.
So it's been a week.
Oh my gosh. It's 2 a.m. right now.
Yeah, and I guess that officially means we are now 2 days behind since it's Wednesday morning. We are 2 days late with the podcast.
I'm behind in everything. Everything I do, I'm behind in.
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on in the world. Obviously, there's been the Black Lives Matter protests sparked by the killing of George Floyd a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. But also there's been a ton of upheaval in the adult industry in the last few days.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of allegations of sexual assault that have been coming out. I mean, the industry is kind of having a Me Too moment.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, AVN published a story that they then immediately unpublished about George Floyd's, I guess, brief involvement in the adult industry.
Yeah.
Or in
right.
porn.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that has also then led to a much bigger discussion about race in the porn industry. XBiz is hosting a town hall, which actually looks promising. I'm pretty excited about it, or hopeful about it.
Yeah,
that something good can really come out of that. A lot of companies have pulled the interracial category, and I think are reviewing some of the other kind of race-related categories. But, for those listeners who might not be familiar, there is this history of companies paying white porn actresses a bonus, almost like a hazard pay or something, the first time they do an interracial scene, which kind of implies that there's something like dirty or particularly devious about having sex with a black man. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of discussion about, whether that feeds into racism.
Yeah, so the stuff that was going on in the adult industry this week was kind of mirroring what was going on in the country writ large. And it meant that we kind of got sidetracked and started working on a lot of these stories.
Yeah, right. I mean, I intended this week just to kind of make a list of industry relevant podcasts, but also ended up writing a piece on the assault allegations. And then you wrote a really wonderful interview of Shy Spells.
Yeah, Shy Spells is a Black indie content creator, and I talked to her a lot about racism within the indie porn world. So obviously I thought we were going to talk about, racism from clients themselves, but what we ended up talking a lot about racism that comes from white models and kind of inner industry racism. And I think she was very honest and said really important things about the way that white content creators and white sex workers treat their Black counterparts that I think white content creators and sex workers really should pay attention to.
Yeah, agreed. It's a really great read, and I think at this moment in time, it's like a crucial read. So I'd really urge everybody to take a look at what Shy Spells has to say.
Yeah, I often think that the news that we get, especially from the adult industry, is often from the people who are at the top of the industry and not a lot from the indie content creators and the people who are, just kind of trying to get by. And so I think it was great to hear the perspective of somebody who's really, really working independently.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely appreciated having that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all of this content, PJ's story about the sexual abuse allegations within the industry, my interview with Shy Spells, the A to Z podcast list, which is the lightest thing that we did this week, all of that can be found on peepshowmedia.com. We are really working hard to build out that site with not only the podcast, which is also obviously there, but with interviews and stories and articles and news and yeah, all of that.
Yeah, so check it out.
Very good.
I'm really great at this marketing thing, by the way.
Yeah, we suck at marketing. However, we are super excited because we got a new big patron today. So we want to give a thanks to
Frankie Rivers.
Frankie Rivers. Yeah, I was going to say Radventure Frankie because that's her AKA. Handle. Yeah. So that's how I think of her in my head. But yes, so that's really cool. So thank you. We've been picking up patrons here and there, and we very much appreciate your support because, like we said, it is 2 a.m. and we are still working. We are like pouring our hearts and souls into this venture. So if you could throw us a few bones, that'd be awesome.
All right, well, we probably should just jump right into our interview with Phoenix Calida then.
Yeah, I love Phoenix. I have been trying to figure out a way to get her on the podcast. So I'm really excited to put out this interview, and I think you all will gain a lot from it.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, let's get to it.
Thanks for joining us today. Jesse and I are dedicated to platforming sex worker voices and covering important political issues for those in the sex trades. But we can't do it without your help.
If you believe in our mission, find us at patreon.com/peepshowpodcast and show us some love.
We're also seeking advertisers to help us grow. Thanks for helping us make Peep Show happen.
We're here today with Phoenix Calida. Hi, Phoenix. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Can you tell our audience a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes. So if you know anything about me, you know I like to talk shit on Twitter. That's one of my primary hobbies. I'm on the national board for SWOP-USA and spend most of my volunteer time and activism time mostly dedicated to sex worker rights and anti-racism action. And I'm from Chicago, and yeah.
Oh, you're in Chicago. I don't think I realized that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were like, "You live in like Detroit, right?" And I was like, "No." I lived in Texas, and I was like, "No."
It's nice to have someone on from the middle of the country. So often our guests are from one or the other of the coasts. We're based in Pittsburgh, and it's it's a different thing. It's a different vibe out here in the not coast.
Oh yeah, yes.
I like Chicago.
Yeah, I'm Midwest to my core. Born and raised out here, so.
Oh, nice. Yeah, so that's actually why we wanted to have you on, because last week was International Horrors Day, which is obviously the, day to commemorate sex workers and the sex worker rights movement. And also, in the meantime, all of the protests are going on. So we wanted to talk to you a little bit about sex worker rights and also about racial justice, which are the things that you work most on. So how are things going for you guys in Chicago, actually? Let's start with that.
Well, as far as the protests go, they've been pretty intense. Chicago police have shown up. At one point, they basically trapped the protesters by raising up all the bridges around them so they couldn't exit the protest area. And, there's a very long history of racism, particularly brutal racism within the Chicago Police Department, as well as an absolute hatred of protesters. So this is sort of like the perfect storm for them to behave the way that they want to behave all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know if you all saw the video. There was a cop who got caught on video, using homophobic slurs and things.
I didn't see that, but there's so much stuff going on.
So many videos from around the country, but I missed that one, I think.
Yeah, there's so much stuff. Somebody threw a piece of garbage at him, and he just turned around, and it was all cussing and threatening people. And then we had the cops just straight up chasing people down the street with, the nightsticks and just pepper spraying people, and a lot of arrests, and just, very typical Chicago police behavior, although probably typical police everywhere behavior.
Right. Yeah, it seems like some cities are more intense than others, but it also seems like this is happening kind of across the board, across the country and across the board.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things that the protests are highlighting now is just this over-policing, and the bad and racist behavior by police isn't just isolated to one department or to one city, but we're really seeing that, this is the norm across the country.
I'm actually really super glad that we have the social media that we have, and we have the internet access that we have in this time, because, police in a lot of ways have always been like this, but I don't think people have actually acknowledged that it's like an across the country thing where it's every state, there's cities in every state, and there's departments in every state that just behave like this as if this was okay. And, because a lot of these stories, I think to a lot of folks still sound kind of outlandish, where they're like, oh, it's just an anomaly.
Right.
That, it was that one cop in like New York City, and you're like, no, it was
Yeah.
in Antonio, and it was in LA, and it was in Oakland, and it was in Chicago, and it was in Detroit, and it was in, Kansas City, and it was in Philadelphia. And no, it wasn't just, New York or Boston or whatever. And so
Yeah.
I think that it's just really good that we have, the social media where we can just automatically do a Facebook Live or do an upload and be like, oh, hey, look what's happening here. And, be able to point out that this is a nationwide problem, because I think people who have been to these protests have spoken on it, right? Like, I think Ferguson was obviously incredibly prominent, but a lot of people I think didn't pay attention because they're like, oh, that's just Ferguson.
Right.
Just that, it's just that department, or it's just that state. And, it happened a lot with Occupy, but people weren't as into social media, I think, at the time. So there just wasn't like, oh, look at this Facebook Live of this police brutality, or look at this, Twitter live stream of this police brutality. And now it's just constantly everywhere. So you can't ignore it anymore.
Right. What do you think that the impact of that's going to be? The fact that there is now like live footage everywhere of police brutalizing people?
I mean, I'm possibly being overly optimistic about it, but I'm hoping that this is going to lead to, honestly, more white folks being radicalized and pushing for racial justice.
Mm-hmm.
There's always this sort of like stereotype when, folks of color, in particular, Black folks, it happens a lot with Native folks too, but especially with Black folks, they'll say, yeah, I was just literally walking down the street and the cops rolled up on me and fucking pulled out nightsticks and started beating the shit out of me. And people are like, you must have done something. Literally just see, I think one of the turning point moments for a lot of folks was watching that elderly man, I forgot his name now.
Right.
Where the cops were like, he just walked up to them and they just pushed him, and he just, falls back and hits his head, and he's bleeding out of his ears, and they just walk over him.
Right.
Yeah.
If they're doing this to like somebody's white grandpa who clearly isn't, he's not like the Antifa super soldier. He doesn't,
Right.
He have an AR-15. He's not like being combative. Like that's just somebody's grandpa walking up to you. If they do that, to that guy on camera.
Right. Same with the journalists as well. I mean, there's been numerous instances now, or at least a handful of instances where you literally see an officer turn around and start shooting somebody who's obviously live reporting, with rubber bullets, clearly targeting the reporters or arresting the CNN reporter. It's unfortunate that there's this respectability element to it, that it takes, somebody's old white grandpa or a CNN reporter to make it clear that, the cops feel like they can act with impunity and, engage in violence against anybody. But it does, seem to be the case that, we have seen, as a result of these protests, or just, in light of these protests, a number of countless, really dozens of
instance
violence
after instance after instance after instance.
Yeah, where the police have engaged in violence against, it's not even just peaceful protesters, but just reporters and bystanders.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's really like a war on the public.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it really be framed that way.
It does very much feel like that. I don't know what your perspective is, but it feels like that's more obvious now than it has been at any other point.
I mean, I guess like for me, I've felt like this for a very long time, because I've been engaged in certain types of activism. I've gone to marches, I've gone to protests. So,
Right.
Like Actually, a couple of years ago, I was actually at Slut Walk Chicago and got completely laid out by Chicago police. Because
Wow. What happened?
I was walking and they were yelling like get out of the street, and I was like, I'm standing on the curb, and it was like, we don't care, we're gonna run you over anyway. And so they were just pushing people, and when they pick up their bikes and hit people, and nobody was actually in the street, and they were just
Yeah.
so like that. Like I was at Ferguson, we were cleaning up some of the broken glass and things that had happened the night before, and police like literally just drove by in their squad cars and just like threw bananas at us.
Oh my God.
Like it's a bunch of black people on their hands and knees.
Yeah.
Just my lived experiences as being black. I had some experience doing street-based sex work. Cops were completely awful with that. Experience with activism, experiences of my other black friends and family.
Right.
And this is kind of how it's always been.
Yeah.
But on camera now, so y'all stop thinking that we're like crazy or just
right.
exaggerating.
Right.
But,
no, yeah, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that like this wasn't happening before. I just meant it is more like on everybody's timeline. It's very hard to escape this now in ways that I think a lot of people who weren't targeted did ignore it before.
Well, or people were insulated by their privilege, right?
Yeah.
So there is this sense that like, of course it was happening, but as you were saying earlier, Phoenix, that, it was easier for white people in particular to dismiss. And I think that, what we're seeing now is that it's harder and harder to ignore the brutality of the police. And I think as a result, it's causing some white people in particular to say, oh, maybe I shouldn't have been so dismissive of what black people are saying, or at least to acknowledge that the police may have been the instigators in a lot of these instances of violence in the past that
may have been. It looks like they always are. Yeah.
A lot of black folks is just like, yep, we knew.
Right.
And now it's like this moment where it's like, and let me tell you all these other stories I have that happened a couple of years ago before like Twitter. Like, let me tell you what it was like before, before like,
right.
Like I have stories for days. It is really unfortunate that it took this level of documented national police aggression for folks to start getting involved. But honestly, I normally wouldn't say better late than never, but in this case, I will say better late than never, because if this does start leading to reforms, that's huge, especially for the folks who have been the most brutalized by police. Like if, we didn't want it to come to this, but if this is what it takes, and this is what it takes, and that's just that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to what you were saying before, too, because it seemed really important in terms of like the experiences you've had as a street-based sex worker, but just more broadly, the issue of course, we've talked about how Black people are disproportionately targeted in this country, are over-policed in this country. But also, I think, you're pointing to the fact that sex workers as well are over-policed in this country. And I think it's worth taking some time to talk about the intersection of those two things, and how both as Black people and as sex workers, Black sex workers, are particularly acutely targeted by police.
When it comes to like sex workers being over policed, I think that follows almost every other sort of trend that we see, right? So like white people and Black people use drugs roughly in the same, the same amount of the population. Yeah. Black people being locked up, right? Mm-hmm. Sex workers are obviously not the majority of sex workers, but they are the majority of arrests. And, then when you start adding in extra things, right? So if we're talking about income-based people who can't necessarily afford a lawyer, right, people who are doing street-based work, they're even more likely to be victims of police brutality. And then you add in, like gender presentation or gender identity, right? So like Black trans sex workers, are incredibly likely to be victims of police brutality. And it's like you just start adding in all these additional factors on top of being a sex worker and on top of being Black. And it's just, really a nightmare. And it's like just assumed that police brutality will be part of your sex work experience.
Right.
Because that's just the way that the system is set up right now. And it's really unfortunate. And, like I think probably one of the most prominent examples of that is the stop and frisk in New York, which obviously, a lot of people know targets people of color, especially Black men disproportionately. But, one of the groups that was especially hit hard with the stop and frisk was Black trans sex workers, where they would be stopped for essentially being in public while being visibly trans. And
Right.
say, oh, you have a condom? Clearly this is a prostitution charge. And it's
Right.
like, not everybody.
Right.
Black trans people are sex workers. Even if they are, they may not be working in. Even if they are working, what the fuck? Like, this is stupid.
Right.
Not be, arresting people for these things, but it's just, the system that we have is incredibly sadistic and it's very punitive. And so there's just not a lot of space to see dignity and humanity in the Black community as a whole. And then when you start getting to like, even more like morally reprehensible, right, in the eyes of respectable white Christian society and lawmakers, like, sex work,
Right.
trans people, and so it's just like more and more it piles on, and it's just really difficult to try to survive that, because it's like you just have to wake up and know that, whether it's because of your gender or whether it's because of your race or whether it's because of your sex work or some combination of all three in that exact
Right.
moment,
Mm-hmm.
just suffer police brutality. And that's a very bleak thing to have to wake up to every day.
Right.
Right. Yeah, and just the approach, I mean, it seems like if you have any one of those identities, let alone all of those identities, there's sort of a presumption of guilt. I mean, that's kind of the logic of stop and frisk. You're presumed to be guilty just, for walking down the street.
Yeah, and I mean, it's terrifying because you can't escape it. You can maybe get yourself out of a class situation a little bit, but if it's about your gender or your race, like you can't, or if you already have like a sex work arrest or conviction, like
Yeah.
you can't get out from under it. It's always there. And that just becomes such an ingrained part of your identity that it's the way the system is set up is just giving police an excuse to just mess with you all the time. And it's like, well, you were already a criminal once, you're going to be a criminal again. And that's very much the attitude. And it's like,
Yeah.
but your criminal sin was not being white, or your criminal sin was being trans, or it was, doing sex work.
Yeah.
But, the system is designed to intentionally dehumanize people. And this is just the end result of it. And it's just absolutely heartbreaking that this is how it goes.
Yeah. So what do you see right now sex worker organizations doing?
Right now I see a lot of sex worker organizations working on bail funds because, of course, sex workers are, again, I talk shit on Twitter, but
Yeah.
sex workers are incredibly multifaceted people. And I think a lot of times that doesn't necessarily like shine through when we talk about like the common perception of what a sex worker is or who a sex worker is.
Right.
Like, oh, you're just a sex worker and that's like that one thing. And it's like, no, sex work is only one part of an identity, right? You can still be a parent. You can still be a sibling. You can still be the child of someone, and you can still be, have a disability or whatever the case may be. And so sex workers, because we're so multifaceted as people, because there's just such a broad range of marginalizations that so many sex workers face, there's a lot of sex workers right now out protesting because they're not just protesting because they're sex workers, but it's also like because Black sex workers have Black children, and we don't want our Black children facing police brutality.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sex workers who are out protesting because another group that's largely targeted by police are people with disabilities, and a lot of sex workers have disabilities.
Yeah.
And like that's why they got into sex work. So they're out there protesting. There's sex workers who are protesting solely because they're sex workers. There's sex workers who are protesting because it's the right fucking thing to do.
Yeah. Right.
So there's just all these different reasons that sex workers are out, and they need just as much help as everybody, as anybody else. And so it's like got to be working on the bail funds, working on getting like street medics out there, working on getting supplies out there, and of course, just in general. Because of these protests and coming right after Corona, a lot of sex workers have been hurting financially because it's just really difficult to work right now and find clients. And so also trying to engage in, community mutual aid to make sure people are, getting fed, and trying to, make sure people are staying housed, and trying to make sure people are staying well. And it's just really stressful, but this is the work that has to be done. So it's getting done.
Yeah. I mean, this has been like incredibly difficult time for sex workers, but for everybody, because all of this is coming off of COVID, which is still happening. And I think that that's something also to think about, is that many sex workers, but also, a lot of people in general like can't work right now or aren't working. Like businesses are just starting to open back up again, but
and sex workers
that's going to be slower for sex
often
workers.
didn't receive the same kinds of, I mean, there was overt discrimination against sex workers in terms of the various social programs that were set up, to help with the COVID-19, whether we're talking small business loans or whether we're talking about unemployment. Sex workers have always had a harder time accessing social programs. And so I think that's been particularly hard right now. It's like a lot of society's police dollars go to, targeting sex workers, but very, very little in terms of actual social support goes to sex workers, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that feeds into that, like, just sort of punitive, criminal justice system that we have. Like, if you just punish someone enough, they're going to change things. And it's like, that's not.
It ignores the reason that people are doing sex work in the first place. It's, people aren't going out there doing sex work because they just love it so much. And, if you just beat them enough, they'll stop.
People still need housing. People still need medications.
Right.
And actually, like, putting people in the system and, like, encounters with cops and having a criminal record and incarceration only make all of those things harder. The criminal justice system doesn't, makes it harder to access all of those basic needs, not easier. And so it's like a feedback loop, really.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I think that's just something that people have this whole, like, well, you did something bad, you deserve to be punished, this, like, very basic but not well thought out, like, if you do the crime, do the time thing. And it's like, okay, now someone did their time. Who's going to hire somebody who has a prostitution record?
Right.
And so, like, but this person still needs to eat. They don't want to starve to death. So
I want to ask you about something that you recently wrote, because you said something about the intersection of sex workers and people with disabilities to be overlapping a fair amount. And I think it's important to talk about what people can do if they can't be out protesting for any reason.
I should just jump in and say, like, still as a cancer survivor, as like a very recent chemo patient, this has been a real struggle for me. This is, something that both with Corona, I've been scared for my life the entire time during this pandemic, but increasingly with the protests, I feel kind of a lot of despair because it's hard right now knowing that I'm so vulnerable.
But you want to go out and be able to
feeling like I really need to do something, but I'm stuck. So I appreciate you sort of broaching that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually really common. A lot of folks can't go out, whether it's because of their own health or because they live with somebody who can't afford that health risk. But I get it. You want to be out there because, like, that's where your comrades are, right?
Right.
Like, you want to be out there. But I mean, it's always important to remember that, any movement is going to require multiple ways to reach the solutions, right? So yes, we absolutely need people in the streets marching, but there's just so many other things, like, and even for people who can physically go out, even if you don't want to march because you don't want to get pepper sprayed and punched in the face because that shit really hurts. You know what I mean? Like, there are options. You can be a legal observer, you can be a street medic, you can just be the person who's got the cooler full of the water bottles or, whatever, bring snacks for people, right? We don't want, we don't want the low blood sugar crowd having issues, but there's always options you can do. And even if you can't be out in person, there's still a lot of things that you can do to help out, right? I mean, obviously money is huge, right? Like, contrary to popular belief, we're not funded by George Soros. I would like to be, but we're not.
Right.
I mean, obviously giving money, helping cook food, helping with daycare, help signal boost things. I think that right now, just because as much as I love social media, because you can put stuff out immediately, one of the drawbacks is that you can put stuff out immediately, right?
Yeah.
And there's all these like, these protesters did this, and then it turns out it's like some video from like 3 years ago for something that wasn't even a protest.
Right. Yeah.
But I mean, even if you have the time to do like the fact checking and be like, no, here's actually where this photo came from. This has nothing to do with this current uprising. But stuff like that, boosting the videos of the police brutality so that it does stay in the public consciousness and, keeping updates on it. I mean, always, it's one of my least favorite forms of activism, but it is still
fact checking is one of your least favorite ones.
I don't know. I was going to say calling your local.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I was like, I know you're not fucking listening to me, but know, but like, I do think it is important as time to be like, hey, we're watching you. Are you defunding the police or are you increasing their budget? Like, we're fucking watching, you
Right.
know, let
Yeah.
folks know.
Yeah, maybe even gathering those statistics. I know that that's one really interesting thing that I've seen during this protest is just that people have been looking at their local budgets and figuring out how much money is going to the police. And you realize, like, wow, this is how much we're spending on the police, you know, versus education, versus, you know, all sorts of other things that are important to the community.
Social programs, yeah.
Yeah, and just like putting that information out there, like I don't think people realize like how much of their local tax dollars go to the police.
Which actually, I don't know if you all saw the tweet about the Chicago budget, but it was like this awkward, like cringe moment where, you know, they had a bunch of activists at sort of like a roundtable meeting and we're discussing it. And they were like, what does 40% mean when I say cops? And everybody was like, how many cops beat their partners, like at like domestic violence issues? And they were like, I was actually talking about how much of Chicago's budget that they get. But like, and it was like, oh, incredibly awkward moment for a lot of people. 40% of the city budget? Like, what the fuck? And then you start looking at like compiling how much like police brutality cases cost in Chicago. I think the last 15 years, we're up to like $800 million.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Like that's and then of course keep in mind too that like 95% of cases never even, you know, the person who got assaulted by police never gets money.
Right.
So it's like that's so far less than what it should actually be.
Right. It should be 20 times that, right?
Exactly. And then you start counting in things like the civil forfeiture, which I guess I'm just going to say this because I've been having this conversation a lot the last week. Apparently people don't know that with civil forfeiture, police can just take your stuff even if you're not convicted of a crime.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of people were under the impression that police can only take your things if you are like arrested and convicted. You do not have to be arrested. You do not have to be convicted. They can just snatch your shit whenever the fuck they want to.
Right. Yeah.
They do because they stole more than burglars, you know, last year. And so, you know, bringing out those kind of numbers and, you know, just pointing out like how many people are killed by police, how many cases there are of police assaulting people, how many, another thing that we really do need to track as far as leftists and police go is how many police have like complaints against them for police brutality or excessive force or whatever. And then they leave a department, but then they get hired somewhere else.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like probably one of the more prominent cases of that was Darren Wilson, right? That's the one who killed Mike Brown because he was on a department that was so corrupt. The entire department got disbanded before he got the job at Ferguson. And it's like, if you were in a department that was so corrupt it got disbanded, how the fuck did you get another job?
Right.
Right.
And why? Why is anyone hiring them?
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and like there's a bunch of cops who have killed people who go on to work in different departments. We should be tracking that so that we know when, you know, because they're going to do something again. As soon as that name comes up, oh yeah, this person already had, you know, 17 complaints in this department. They killed someone in this department. Like we need to have stats. And, you know, even if you can't be in the streets protesting, someone still has to compile those numbers and compile those facts, you know, like that's still important work.
Yeah.
And so there's like a lot of stuff that we need to bring together.
Yeah. Yeah, because you would think that we have the right as like citizens of any particular city to know if they're bringing in cops that have killed people in other jurisdictions. Yeah.
Well, I think that's the thing is when you say it, it makes sense. But a lot of people, I think, are caught up in the protest thing because it's exciting. That's where the energy is. It's like you feel like you're making an immediate difference because you're standing up to the cops like toe to toe. And it's, you know, like there's energy there. But like, going back and Googling and compiling numbers of, it's not fun.
Right.
Like it's, you know what I mean? Like, because people want to be on the front lines and I get that, but this other work still needs to be done and not everybody can be on the front lines. Not everybody should be on the front lines. So,
right.
You know, seriously talk about the other things that we need to do because this is an entire movement. This is an entire goal and you have to approach it, you know, with multiple strategies. Just marching is not going to solve. Like if marching would have solved police brutality, we would have had police brutality ended years ago. Right. So we have to keep, you know, this sort of like multi-strategy approach to things.
Yeah. And also, I mean, movements have people with diverse ranges of skills to do different parts of it. And not everybody is suited to be marching for one reason or another.
Yep, exactly. You know, one of the things I find with a lot of these uprisings is that something that's not really talked about a lot is like mental health and emotional health. And spiritual. And it's like, you know, even if you can't be on the streets, if you can, you know, like check in on people like mentally, especially if you have a background in any sort of like spiritual training or is like a therapist, you are sorely needed right now.
Yeah.
They're more traumatized than they realize in this moment.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely absolutely a need for that. There's a need for people to, do news. Like one of the things that I hate when it comes to news, I know I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theorist or whatever, but the thing about news is how like it's not considered to be valid unless it's like mainstream or like, but did someone on CNN say it? And I'm like, man, fuck CNN, right?
Right.
Because why is someone on CNN reporting on the ground more valid than just an average person who has an iPhone who's, recording everything live?
Yeah.
Do you think they're like editing their Facebook live in real time? Like, what the fuck do you think they're doing?
Right.
And getting those sort of people on, like leftist based podcasts and news shows and things like that. Like, we really need to bulk up leftist media. It's not happening. And I think that's really unfortunate because as long as we rely on more mainstream avenues to carry the narratives, then ultimately we're just basically shooting ourselves in the foot with it,
I mean, they all have their own like corporate interests and reasons for spinning the news in ways that they do.
I guess like the prime example right now was that fucking was it the New York Times?
Tom Cotton, talking about deploying the troops to quote unquote quell the peaceful protests.
Right. Yeah. You want to know why a corporate-owned news outlet shouldn't be the one running the narrative? Because they publish shit like that.
Right.
That was just an open call for bloodshed and killing civilians. Military come in and kill civilians, and like that should be terrifying to everyone. And any sort of corporate-owned media outlet that promotes that, like, yeah, we should have an alternative to that. Like, we need leftist news media.
Yeah, you probably didn't see this because this is so like Pittsburgh specific, but our like main newspaper, which is dying right now in Pittsburgh, pulled their only like Black woman reporter off covering the Black Lives Matter movement at all because they didn't like a tweet that she posted.
What?
They pulled her off, and then a bunch of reporters and people who work in media in Pittsburgh stood beside her, and they just retaliated and pulled a bunch of those people off reporting as well. So they're
wow, that's really ridiculous.
Yeah. And the reason that she got pulled off reporting anything that has to do with Black Lives Matter is because she posted a picture of after a Kenny Chesney concert, and it was like a mess and said, "Look what happens after protest." Just kidding. This is the aftermath of a Kenny Chesney concert. Right. And they don't even have a social media policy, but they decided that she's too biased, so she can't like report there. And then they started retaliating against anybody who stood up for her. We can't trust our newspaper at all.
Yep, and that's why we need leftist media.
Right. I mean, I was happy to see how many people, stood up for her, but even more disheartened to see that created a lot of problems for a lot of reporters in Pittsburgh.
Right, but to even report on that, we need like the only reason we know that happened is because we have social media and because we have alternative sources of media. I'm not sure what would have happened 20 years ago. You know? If that story would have even been disseminated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely need leftist media.
Now is a good time to hit the pause button and head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Even $1 a month shows us that you care and want to see Peep Show continue to thrive. Also, you can help increase our reach with a review on iTunes. Yeah.
So one other direction I kind of want to take this conversation is, I have a sense of our listenership. I know we have a lot of white listeners. I know we have some civilian, that is to say non-sex worker listeners. And so for folks who want to be good allies, who maybe aren't as directly impacted by these issues of discrimination, of police brutality, can we talk a little bit about what it means to be a good ally to Black people, to sex workers, to Black sex workers, but just this idea of allyship a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to, and it's so cliche because we say it all the time, but it's true, is ally is a verb, right?
Mm-hmm.
It requires action. And, that action isn't going to look the same for everybody, or it won't look the same in every situation, but it is still some type of action. So, first of all, you have to be willing to act. And like, let's just start with that, because a lot of people will be like, oh, well, I retweeted that one hashtag that was trending a couple of times. And it's like, that's not
Right.
really helping. Like,
Yeah.
bad, but that's not really helping. But I think some of the things to do is not, or maybe this is just me. You know what? I'm just going to speak for myself on this one because this shit pisses me off. Please do not approach people who have been doing something for a long time and ask them like super basic questions.
Mm-hmm.
You can educate yourself. If you want to ask for a list of how to get educated, who to follow, who to talk to, who to read, like that's one thing. But if you are educating yourself, then you actually need to educate yourself. And it's really, really frustrating how, like, still to this day, like, I'm still on Twitter explaining the difference between decriminalizing and legalizing sex work.
Right.
And it's like,
Right.
I've been doing this for like
Yeah.
6 years on Twitter. Like, can I please?
Yeah. Talk about something else. Yeah.
But it's like, and that's one of those things. And like, I get that you're like, oh, well, this person knows about it. Let me ask them. But you should first maybe think, am I the first person who thought this person knows things? Maybe I should ask them, because odds are they've answered this question like 10,000 times before. And it's just really tiring when they're like, a new person is like, tell me again. And it's like, you couldn't have like searched, like,
Right.
done the search terms at least.
Yeah.
Right. There are literal books on these topics.
Exactly. Like, I'm at a point on Twitter, like, someone actually got really mad at me because they kept asking me these questions. And I was like, seriously, just Google Phoenix Calida and those search terms. Like, I'm not
I hear that because I get that a lot with just basic sex work questions. And I'm like, I can't go on another interview and answer like what a sex worker is. I just can't.
Right.
I just can't do it.
And then people are like, why won't you educate me? I'm just trying to learn. And it's like, if you're trying to learn, then learn. Like, you don't need me to hold your hand every step of the way. Like, if you see something you're like, I don't understand, that's one thing. But like, come on, like asking these really basic questions when there's been books and podcasts and just interviews and tweet threads and
Right.
blogs
Mm-hmm.
and, all these things dedicated to it. And it's like, you have to be willing to do some of that legwork on your own.
Right.
At least familiarize yourself with concepts and, like the basic ideas as far as what the problems are. And it's just really frustrating when people don't do that. And then they're like, well, you're not educating me, so I'm not going to participate in being an ally. And it's like, are you sure you wanted to be an ally in the first place? I'm really not.
Yeah. You just wanted to have your hand held and make yourself feel like you're doing something. Yeah.
Exactly. I feel like that a lot of people will fall into that category. But of course, that's easy, right? 'Cause you're like, oh, I tried, but they just wouldn't educate me. So I don't know. I'm not getting involved. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a really easy cop out, but that's still a cop out. Like, you can do better if you want to do better. So,
Right.
there's that. But I mean, I think one of the biggest things is just start following people who talk about these things on, whatever it is that you do. I mean, and I think that's like the beauty of it when it comes to talking about like racial politics, and when it comes to sex work politics, and when it comes to Black sex work politics, is that, people who are in those categories have been talking about these things forever. There are entire books that are dedicated to it. There's magazine articles, there's independently published zines, there's podcasts, there's blogs, there's people who run social media pages, there's Twitter threads. Like, if you want to find that information, it is there.
Right.
And I just reading it and really thinking about it and signal boosting it. Like, that's one of the biggest things, is to signal boost, because something that unfortunately I see a lot when it comes to marginalized groups is, you'll see people say like, oh, I never thought about, this concept like that. And then someone with more privilege, like, basically regurgitates it and rehashes it, and they like get all the clicks.
Yeah. Right.
You could have just like kept the original source,
Right.
Right.
And actually, Connor Habib just made a thread about this yesterday, and it was like such good timing because I felt it so hard. Where he was saying that, like, because of the whole Lindsey Graham thing, I'm sure y'all have seen it. A bunch of reporters are trying to get on this, like, if you know anything about it, I'll collab with you. And he's like, did you ever stop and think that maybe a sex worker who is involved with this, or a sex worker in general who's involved with anything, would be a better writer than you?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe
And
they
maybe
need
have
you.
more insight into something like this. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Like maybe they don't need you to collab. Maybe they can write shit on their own.
Right.
You know, like I just really felt that sentiment because that's just something I see all the time is people saying, oh, well, you have to go through a sort of like legitimate source or whatever. So you have to work with a reporter or you have to, have an academic like rehash what you said. And it's like, we are perfectly capable of speaking for ourselves, right? And
Right. And do a better job of it.
honestly, yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's getting into this sort of narrative is that like, oh, they're the voiceless people. I need a voice. And it's like, we don't need saviors. Like we don't need rescuers. We're not puppies.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
We're perfectly capable of speaking for ourselves in these communities. We have been speaking for ourselves loudly, boldly for years and years
Right.
and years. And, if you want to know how we feel firsthand, like that information is completely accessible. So access it,
Right.
and use that. Don't signal boost, someone who's like 4 like levels away being like, oh, I read a book and saw a documentary and now I'm writing about it.
Right.
When you could just read the same book.
Yeah. Right.
I guess we should acknowledge that algorithms are racist and sexist, that institutions like publishers are racist and sexist, academia is racist and sexist, right? And so there's a tendency to like ignore marginalized voices in favor of privileged voices. But like, I guess, part of being a good ally too is to use your platform to try to subvert the like racism and sexism of those institutions to help like overcome the algorithms, to help people, pitch to publications, to help people navigate systems like academia so that they can speak on their own rather than like co-opting their words and then like stamping your name on it.
Absolutely. I think that's hugely important. And I think a lot of allies really go into it. Like they really do go into it with good intentions of like, I'm just trying to, make it more acceptable to mainstream society. But it's like, that's not helping in the
Right.
long
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Because then we're still not allowed to be part of mainstream society.
Yeah.
And so, like, these levels of marginalization or oppression are never going to change because we're not allowed to be seen as fully dignified humans. And we're always going to need a translator or a savior to,
Or legitimator. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's just not helping in the long run.
Right.
No, I really feel that hard because like, personally as an academic, I mean, I'm a white dude. I'm walking around in the world with a lot of privilege, but still, like as a sex worker, the amount of places that I can work as an academic is like 5%, like it's really, really hard still to find a place in a lot of these institutions if you have like a marginalized status. And I think that, a lot of people don't appreciate that or realize that. And it's like, so much of the fight is not to just like take people's words and, reproduce them, but it's like, how do we fight to actually include those people into the institutions and, give them platforms to speak for themselves or really allow them to access the platforms that they deserve.
Absolutely. I think that's hugely important.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you think is important to think about right now while all of this is going on, while the protests are still going on, why COVID is still going on?
I feel like all of this, like as the apocalypse is...
I know. That's what I was trying to think. As the world is like on its head. I don't know. I don't even know how to describe what's going on right now.
Everything's going wrong. That one of the things is right now to understand that we are a community, regardless of, our marginalizations or our particular identifiers. I think that we are going to need to branch out to work on more community-based solutions. But in order for that to happen, to really get folks with privilege to rethink how they see the world. And I think that's really difficult. I think that everything going wrong right now is helping. Unfortunately, it took that. But I think like this is honestly a golden opportunity to start coalition building. And I really hope that we don't let that go to waste.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is just like an incredibly important time for that because it's like, wait, you can get fucked up by police just like me.
Yeah.
Wait, I can get police, fucked up by police just like you. And it's like, let's form solutions around that, around shared struggles.
Right.
And if there's different levels of privilege and whatnot, obviously, but, if we're both under threat from police, maybe that can be a starting point of, building coalitions. And I think that's going to take all of that to dismantle the society.
Mm-hmm.
Ask that people who have more privilege really be cognizant of how they are asking for labor for less marginalized folks.
Yeah.
Right? Like right now, folks who are in the streets in the protests or are deeply involved with this sort of activism are tired and drained, and, maybe just think about little things you can do. Like, I know a lot of Black people are really fucking tired of seeing videos of cops killing us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe, if you have a story about police brutality, maybe don't show the video. Maybe like crop out part of the picture. You can still tell the story without putting that sort of imagery directly into somebody's news feed.
Right.
Yeah.
Be cognizant about things like that. Be cognizant about what type of labor you're asking for. Don't just, approach a conversation and be like, so tell me about Black people getting killed. And it's like, this is a sensitive topic and people are drained and people are tired,
Right.
and patient with folks, honestly. And I think this is an incredibly trying time. And I think that, we will get over this, but we definitely need our allies to get that, verb part of ally on and really get serious about action. And then we can start creating social reforms. We can start creating societal change. But
Yeah.
if they're just mad because white people are getting tear gassed by police, and as soon as it's over, go back to ignoring how police treat, Black and brown communities, then in 20 years, we're going to be right back here again.
Right.
Right.
Like, this is the time to start working on preventative measures if you don't like the way that things are. I just don't want that opportunity to be squandered.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that this is a time that we can start to rebuild something different.
I'm really excited by the amount of people I see saying defund the police. That warms my heart.
We've talked about the Overton window, this idea that there are certain things that are considered within the bounds of like respectability to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And then, things that aren't in that window are considered too radical.
Yeah.
And I think really one of the consequences of the recent protest is that the Overton window has expanded. Like, I have never, until the last 2 weeks or so, seen discussion of defunding the police on places like NPR or CNN. And I have seen those words now uttered in those kinds of mainstream media sources. And, and that legitimizes those positions in a way that, or perhaps, the work of the protesters has legitimized those positions. And, and unfortunately, the images we've seen and the media is a reflection of that legitimization. But in any case, it does seem that the window has expanded, and, it's acceptable, in these respectable sources now to, quote unquote, respectable sources now to talk about things like defunding the police, in ways that wasn't the case before.
Yeah.
Well, I think that actually points back to what you were saying earlier, Phoenix, in terms of the importance of research, like also people putting out information about how much funding is going to the police helps with this, with changing the conversations about how much money they should be getting and should.
Oh, absolutely. And I also think it's important too to, research, like, I hate to say, like, just have a bunch of talking points, because that's not necessarily the most conducive way to have conversation. But, you should research what you're talking about and know what the stance is. I see, I still, because, I'll say I'm a prison abolitionist. I, like, again, have been having this conversation since I've been on Twitter. But still, as soon as they're like, well, what about the rapists? And it's like, let's talk about that then.
Right.
Like, let's talk about how many untested rape kits there are. Let's talk about how many rapes straight up go unreported. Let's talk about how, how many times convictions never happen. Let's talk about how it wasn't until like the 1990s that spousal rape was illegal in all 50 states.
Right.
And like that's one of the conversations that I've seen going on right now is every time that comes up for women in particular to say what happened when they reached out to the police to report their rapes, and that they didn't come out feeling safer or heard or like they had any recourse for anything. So
absolutely. And I think it's just things that people have never considered, because when something is just so ingrained in the culture and it's just seen as like common knowledge, it's, like bumper sticker rhetoric, but it's never really meant to be critically thought about. And it's like, okay, let's actually talk about rapists. How many rapists are in prison?
Mm-hmm.
So when you say that we need police to protect us from rapists, is that what's actually happening?
Right.
you know?
And I mean, the question too is like, isn't there another way? Like, couldn't we
Yeah.
set up systems where if you are raped, there is somebody to call that's not the police that can give you resources?
Yeah. And actually, I got to go back and find the study again, but there was a study where it was a mandatory thing where if you went to the ER to report a sexual assault, they automatically called police, and people would walk in, wanting medical attention because they've been assaulted sexually and sometimes physically as well, and hear that police were going to get involved and turn around and walk right back out the door. And it's like, so who is serving?
Yeah, we
Right.
had to have that conversation with our local rape crisis center here in Pittsburgh, and talk to them very explicitly about, if someone comes through the door and identifies as a sex worker, you need to very, clearly signal to them that they have the option to receive resources without police involvement, and that needs to be a way that they improve their messaging.
Absolutely. And even that is like a larger issue in and of itself. And it's like, well, why is it that people are scared to go to police when they're the victims of an incredibly heinous crime?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. And talking about the larger level reform, I mean, it's important to recognize that, and this has been studied. There's a Yale meta study that looks at a bunch of different smaller studies done on the city levels, but that I think a lot of marginalized populations, but sex workers in particular, cite police as a major source of violence and sexual assault, and fear encounters with the police. It's not only that police are ineffective at helping sex workers to seek justice for the sexual assaults that they experience, but in fact, police are a main source of those sexual assaults.
Yeah, every time I mention that, people really think I'm kidding when I say that it's legal for police to rape sex workers in a lot of circumstances. And it's like, no, really, that's a thing. And so why, the community is not going to go back and trust these folks.
Right.
And, in the context of like the human trafficking investigations, right? But that's not even counting the context where police just really just approach sex workers and, say that if you don't perform, XYZ sex act, I'm going to arrest you. And it's like, that's incredibly common, especially for lower income and straight-based sex workers. And it's like, why would these folks then trust police, and say, I mean, it's not even just for sexual assault, but for anything. Like,
right.
Like, if your car breaks down, you wouldn't call police to help you change a tire. If someone robbed your house, you wouldn't call police to help you solve the crime, because these are the same people who were like, I'm going to rape you because I can, and you can't do anything about it.
Right.
And the system creates that, right? Like the system, and I think that's the important part. Like when we talk about, prison abolition or defunding the police, it's like, the important thing to recognize is that, like, it's the system where we give one group of people a tremendous amount of power over other people, and we give them the tools of violence, that, like, it's that structural situation that ultimately enables cops to rape people, particularly marginalized people, with impunity. And that, like, so long as we create structures where certain people have that power over other people, it's almost an inevitability that you're going to see that kind of violence.
I'm glad that that's coming out, because I feel it needs to be discussed, but it's also like distressing that so many people don't know this or haven't thought about this when they're just, first reaction, you can't defund police. Like, but what about rape victims? And it's like, no.
Yeah.
Actually sit down and like fucking consider what you're saying in practice.
Right.
And how, because that's just not how it works. And I think a lot of people are just really uncomfortable because this is the system that we've always had. It's what's always been in place, and they're scared about tearing it down and trying something radically different. But it's like, what we have isn't working, and it's not only not effective when it comes to resolving crimes, it's creating a lot more victims because we have this power, and it's just, we have to do something different. Like this just isn't working.
Yeah.
To be clear, I don't think anybody is trying to diminish, like, the significance or the problem of rape or, rapists or rape culture, but it's just a question of, like, is policing and mass incarceration really the most effective way of addressing that problem? Are there other approaches that are more effective that we could be trying? And those are the conversations that we aren't having, or at least we haven't been having until very recently, that we, probably need to be happening. And I guess that that is one change that at least I'm seeing, is that these kinds of conversations about like what are the alternatives to policing. I mean, of course, those have been happening in leftist circles for decades, but I'm seeing that now spill over into mainstream media. And to me, anyways, in my lifetime, anyways, that seems to be a first.
Yeah, I'm super excited about that happening.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was going to take a lot longer for these conversations to happen, but I'm glad that they're happening for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's probably a good place to end. Where can people find you and your work?
Well, you can always find me on Twitter. The @ is Uppity Negress with 2 P's, 2 T's, and 2 S's. I'm also the co-host of the Black podcast with Wine Cellar Media. You can find us there. We have pretty much any podcast application. We also have the Blog Talk feed if you're into that. And we post news on winecellarmedia.com. And yeah, also we have the Social Dissonance page on Facebook if you're still using that particular. I say that with an attitude because I don't like Facebook. But
I don't use Facebook. PJ keeps it only to put our podcast up on Facebook. But I do all the social media except for that. And he's like, I hate Facebook. And I was like, sorry, I won't have a Facebook account. So you have to run that.
I have a Facebook account specifically to post to that page. So if you do like Facebook and you want to follow the Social Dissonance page, please feel free to do so.
All right. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you so much for letting me hang out with y'all.
Yeah, it was nice.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter @PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter @sapiotextual or @jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.